Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Penning the Past, Insights into San Diego's Historic Neighborhoods and Architecture. I'm Dean Glass, and I'm delighted to be kicking off our 2026 lecture season with you. Now in its third year, Penning the Past continues to explore San Diego's historic neighborhoods, architecture, and the people who shaped them through the work of authors, historians, and preservationists who help us see our city with fresh eyes. Whether you're a longtime SOHO supporter or joining us for the first time, thank you for being a part of this community and for supporting our shared mission to preserve San Diego's historic places and stories. Today's lecture takes us back to the very beginning. Before there was a Los Angeles or a San Francisco, there was El Presidio de San Diego, Spain's first colony in Upper California and the foundation of everything that followed. We're honored to welcome Richard L. Carrico, whose decades of archaeological and historical research have quite literally unearthed the story of San Diego's lost city. Richard is an archaeologist, historian, and retired professor of American Indian Studies at San Diego State University. He has authored 5 books, written more than 30 academic articles, and directed archaeological excavations at both the San Diego Presidio and Mission San Diego de Alcalá. His work has been instrumental in shaping our understanding of early California history. Please join me in welcoming Richard Carrico for today's lecture, El Presidio de San Diego, Excavating Southern California's Lost City.
Well, good morning, Dean, and thanks for the introduction. I appreciate that. One of the things that I always get asked, and probably every author gets asked when they come out with a book, is why did you write it? And the answer for the Presidio of San Diego is very simple. There was no one book or even a good brochure or a monograph that tourists down in Old Town or tourists up on Presidio Hill could turn to and find out more about the Presidio. So the Serra Museum has some pretty good displays and some plasma screen video images going on, but I thought there should be a book. So what we're going to talk about today is that new book that came out in October. But more importantly, and I want to stress this, I like to talk about the people, not just archaeology. There's a tendency amongst some archaeologists to get too caught edifices. They sort of have an edifice complex. And artifacts, they want to talk about pottery and ceramics and arrow points, all good, no doubt about it. But I think you need to put the people back into the images. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let me share my screen here and we'll get going. Presidio of San Diego is in fact where it all began. What is the all and what's the it? Well, in this case, it's the Franciscan missions of California. We ended up with 21. And the Presidio, again, my apologies. So one of the most important people at the Presidio was Fernando Rivera y Moncada, who was the commandant from almost its beginning until his murder on the Colorado River in 1778. So one of the reasons we know a lot about the Presidio is he left us a great diary, and we can delve into the executions of some Native Americans at the Presidio. We can delve into the building of the Presidio and the things that we're going to talk about, in part because of his diary. So he was actually killed on the Colorado River in 1778 on one of his many trips in Travis back and forth from the Presidio to San Javier de Bac. And he would bring settlers, cattle, sheep. And about the 4th time that he came across, the Quezon Indians, specifically La Palma, the chief, killed him and took hostages and essentially closed the Colorado River crossing at Yuma until the American period in 1850. So some of you may know this already, and I find a lot of people don't. So if you go to Mission Valley today, you go about 6 miles up the river from Highway 5, you'll find the mission sitting up there on the hill. And the sign out front says, site of California's first mission, Mission San Diego de Alcalá. Well, that's actually not true. The first mission was at the foot of Presidio Hill, if you will. And it was just a rude brush hut where Father Unepero Serra set up business in May of 1769. There was a second mission built on Presidio Hill itself, and they did missionize Native Americans there. And so if you're looking for the first mission in all of California, I must stress this, Alta California, because there were already 21 or 22 missions down in Baja California, you want to go to Presidio Hill. That's where the first mission was. And the second mission, in theory. I also want to stress that the Presidio, coming from the Latin presidium, was more than just a fort. It was a frontier outpost, it was a settlement, and it comes from the Latin word presidium, meaning to preside. Governors will live there, commandants will live there, and then one of the things that we found out going through the census records and all the material was that, in fact, there were more children at the Presidio than adults. And if you think about it, that's not too hard to figure out because you've got a Spanish soldier, later Mexican soldiers, and they married Native American women, Kumeyaay, Cochimí, Paipai, Kokapa. So from that union of a man and a woman, you could get 5, 6 children. And so you're going to change the ratio to where less than a third of the people there will be adults and the other 2/3 will be children. And that showed up in the archaeological record with little heads of dolls, clay cannons, marbles, and other toys associated with children. The Presidio was active from its first construction in 1769 until 1835, after the Mexican Revolution. Here's what the site looked like in 1927. Very briefly, at one point, this entire hill was slated for development. Mission Hills was already being built on top of the hill, and certain developers wanted to come down the hill and build 6 or 8 homes on lots on this roughly 4-acre, 5-acre parcel there. George Marston, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, wanted to save the hill. He approached the city hoping they would buy it and make a park out of it, and they did not want to. Kind of continuing this story, the city of San Diego still does not embrace Presidio Park, spends very little time or money on it. It's kind of the little lame child of the parks in San Diego. So Marston sat down with 2 other local gentlemen, a guy named Spreckles, that you might know, and Spalding of the sporting goods fact. And they bought the hill. And then the plan was to turn it into a park. So you see where the arrow was pointing. Marston commissioned a fellow named Percy Broll, who was a city engineer, to do some archaeology. That arrow is pointing towards what's really the first mission in Alta California, not the one in Mission Valley. And this is going to be excavated, started in 1968. If you go to where the cross is, over here, toward the bottom central of the picture, that's where the commandant's house was. Over to the far left, above the dirt road, which is Taylor Street, by the way, is where the barracks were and the casitas for the married couples, blacksmith shops, carpentry shops. So the Presidio was a self-contained unit. It had carpenter shops, it had blacksmiths, it had hornos for baking bread, and you had families living there. Dunepero Serra Museum on the top was built with funds put up by local people, including Marston and others. And the city had very, very little to do with it, quite frankly. So today, many people, when they drive by, especially tourists at night out on Highway 8, look up and believe that that is, in fact, the first mission. And it's a beautiful museum instead. Very briefly, but for those of you into the architecture of it, this is how a adobe structure would have been built. In particular, here at the Presidio, you dig a large trench. In those trenches, you're going to put boulders. And then on top of the boulders, you're going to put unfired adobe blocks. Keep going up about 10 feet, 11 feet, put in some cross beams, and then you're going to ultimately use fired clay tiles for the roofing. So one thing I want to stress about all this work, digging those trenches, building up, bringing up more than 10,000 of these 20 to 30 pound boulders, All of this work was done by Native Americans. So when we talk about the Padres building or the um, commandant's building, they're supervisors, and who's doing all the physical labor are Native Americans, largely Kumeyaay and largely Tipai from people south of the San Diego River. But there were some Cochimí working there also, and occasionally some other Native Americans. The soldiers occasionally worked, but only occasionally, because like all soldiers, having been one myself at once, that's not your job. That's not your occupational specialty in the military. You're there to be a soldier, and in your off time, the last thing you want to do is dig trenches or make adobe blocks. The wood for this, by the way, most of it came from Corte Madera, up outside near Alpine on the way further east. Why there? I mean, there were oaks growing closer to the coast. It's because the trees were larger and you could get more timber out of them. And again, that work was done by Native Americans using mules and the supervision of some higher ranking soldiers. So those logs were faced up, cleaned up a little bit, and then dragged by mules down to the Presidio. Here's Moncada's diary, if you're interested in reading Spanish. Amazing stories of San Diego. And on the right-hand side is a baptismal record from 1770s, and it's baptism number 472 there on the right-hand side. And the beauty of these baptisms is they tell us about the Native Americans. They tell us what the native name would have been for this person, this individual, more often than not children, but not always, what their Spanish name became, what their parents' name was, if the parents were baptized or not, and what village they're from. So when we look at 4.2 here on the right-hand side, this is the village of Sol, which was known as Istawa, which is right where the coaster station is off of 805 and 5 in Sereno Valley. The one below it, at the very bottom right-hand corner, is Utai, which we, of course, have changed to Otai. Just amazingly invaluable records. And there are 4,000 of these baptisms, by the way, of Native Americans. When San Diego State started digging in 1968, they were digging over in the right-hand side of what's now the Presidio by the Marston Wall. They were told to dig there because that was probably where the commandant's house was. It was said in 1968 that where the cross is today, and was in 1968, slightly up the hill, was where the church was. And why was the church there? Well, it was believed the church was because that's where the cross was. But in fact, the cross was put there by the Filipino Society because that's where they thought the church was. That's called circular reasoning. In fact, when Paul Ezel, following up on Dr. Brandis's work in 1968, started digging at the Presidio over on the right-hand side, where the commandant's house was supposed to be, it turned out he was in fact in the chapel. This map was not found several years after the dig was going on. So those of you that do historical research, you know how this goes. Found in a leave to Barbara and then we had a map. By then the dig was already 4 or 5 years old. This is made by Guadalupe Vallejo, who you might remember. And in 1876, H.H. Bancroft hired different people to do research that led to his massive history of California, multi-volumes. And one of the interviews that was completed was with Vallejo. And he was asked about the Presidio. He was a corporal back in the 1820s. And the researcher he was working with sketched this map. It's an amazingly accurate map in many ways. Up behind the Presidio itself, sitting up here in what's now the parking lot, was the Casa Mata, which is where you keep your gunpowder and some of your armaments. They had learned by then to not keep this within the forts, but rather slightly outside. And then we have the original entrance, which would have been from the Taylor Street side, what's now Taylor Street, coming up the hill, not where we come through today from the Old Town side. In the road, this curve comes back, goes up to the parking lot. On the left-hand side of the mighty San Diego River that is there, That's where the casitas would have been, blacksmith shops, and such as that. In the front, very front, near the gate, there was a prison. Typically, that prison would have held both soldiers and maybe some merchants who had got sideways with the Spanish and Mexican authorities, but more often than not, it was holding Native Americans. So once the dig had started, we're looking at it right now from the bottom, that is the front door, very close to the front door at the bottom of the image here, in the nave. So we're in the altar, we're in the chapel. And those of you that might take the tour next week, that guy standing there at the top with, I think he's actually spraying some fixative on something. That's where we're going to be standing for a while, right above the altar. So if we look in the front of this picture, below the person kind of squatted over and digging, that is the altar. That is the altar of the 1778 chapel made by Lieutenant Zuniga. And the altar is made out of fired adobe tiles. Depending on where you are in Mexico, they're called ladrillos or baldosas. And those are fired tiles that would have been stuccoed over and then an altar cloth put on top of it. It's sitting on the altar platform. Off to your left, you've got an adobe wall, unfired adobe, with stucco still on it. One of the amazing things that we discovered in the excavations, some of the stucco was painted. In some cases, it had Castilian roses. In other cases, it had the native grape. And in other cases, it had some ivy. So after all these years, this is 1778 when this was painted, and it might have been touched up over the years, there was still paint on the stucco. And we'll talk about that a little bit. The floor tiles in front of the altar, as we're standing here in the nave, ultimately revealed burials. So you can sort of see some slumping going on there. And in that slumping, there were burials. There were 20 individuals buried within the chapel itself. Children, Native Americans, Henry Delano Fitch and his daughter, Natalia, are buried there. So up to 20 people were buried in the church itself. One of the interesting things about San Diego Chapel is it was not based on status. In some Catholic churches, more status gets you closer to the altar or it gets you in the chapel itself or in a side chapel. Here, status does not seem to play a role, nor did gender, nor did gender. So this is further along. This is probably about 1972, 73. And once Paul Wiesel, who was leading the dig, started excavating the burials, he had to get in there and try to get them out, look at them and study them, and then put dirt back in. Because we do get rain, and if you have something open, in essentially an open church in this case, with water draining across, it will destroy a lot of material. I'd like to get rid of a slight myth. History has lots of myths. One of the myths about this excavation is that all the burials that were found, and there were 120, were taken out of the ground, taken back to San Diego State College, later university, and studied. And some got lost, and then some were repatriated back into the ground here. Actually, very few were taken out because their condition was such that it didn't lend itself to it. They were skeletal materials, obviously. And in other cases, was not something Paul Wiesel wanted to do. So a lot of the osteology, the study of the remains that were done, there's a whole master's thesis on 90 of them, was done in the ground. Some were indeed taken out, some parts and studied, but most of it was done in the ground. So here in the very, very front, these people bending over, this is Greta Ezel on the right-hand side. Some of you might remember Greta, Paul's colleague and wife. They're digging somebody out of the platform right in front of the altar. That other couple a little further back, they're digging another burial, person in the striped shirt off the left, yet another. And then if we look towards the right upper hand corner, the balding gentleman there standing there, that's Colonel Ellis, who was an amazing volunteer for the History Center for years. He's standing next to Henry Delano Fitch and Natalia Fitch's burials. So roughly 20 within the church itself and another 100 out in the Campo Santo. there's a problem here, a conundrum. Burial records, which I've looked at extensively over the years, there's 220 people buried here on Presidio Hill, slightly more actually, but 220 in the burial records, and yet we only found 120. Where are the missing people? Many of them are outside the Marston Wall north in the grassy area of Presidio Park. Others were probably infants or young children who frankly disintegrated relatively early and we're never likely to find those. But I would say the majority of the missing 100 are outside the Marston Wall. At one time, cadaver dogs were brought out there to search beyond the Marston Wall in that grassy area, and they kept alerting and alerting and alerting. So that is where a lot of the missing folks are to this day. When we were all done in 1976, and I was in charge of the dig for a year or so back in 75, 76, when we were all done, everything got covered up yet again, just as Marston had done back in 1927. Dirt was brought back. We covered everything up, first with some plastic and sand, and then soil, and then resodded everything as it is today. Paul Wiesel wanted an image of what the chapel might have looked like. And I want to stress, this presentation largely is about the chapel. Other people, Jack Williams, Brad Bartell, Diane Barbola, dug other parts of the Presidio. This is largely on the chapel. So I was a dominant at one time, or at least I was going to be one. And so I did the isometric. I did the outlines of the chapel based on hundreds and hundreds of pages and sketches of archaeological records. So Bruce and Alana might remember back in the day, we all took notes in speckled notebooks. That's black and white old lab books. So we took those and Xeroxed them and stuck them up on the walls of a room and basically reconstructed Presidio by walking around the room and putting the images, sketches where they should be. And then I did the isometric. Randy Hawkins, a student at the time, who's still around, very good artist. In fact, she works at the Spanish artist village down there in Balboa Park. She did the beautiful drawings. So this is an older slide. It's faded a little bit, but I think you get the idea. This is what the Presidio would have looked like. About 90 feet long and about 30 feet wide. It had columns made out of wood running up the walls to hold them, certainly, and the ceilings. And these were painted faux marble to make them look like marble. Very common. It had wainscoting, so towards the bottom, this is where we found the paintings. Here's an altar rail up in the left-hand corner a little bit, a rug on the floor. Well, Richard, how'd you know what the rug looked like? You didn't dig that up. No, but we had great records of it. We have the inventory of the materials taken to the Presidio, and that rug is described as a silk rug from China by way of Manila. You have the altar there, and then behind the altar, you have the various statues and statuettes of the saints. Here's the front door, and it never had a bell tower. Somebody described it as 3 sticks with 2 bells. This would have been the bells that would have been used to call people to Mass and for other purposes within the Presidio itself. Almost in the center, but not quite, off to the left. This is a side chapel, probably commissioned by Felipe Romero, the blacksmith. 2 of his children are buried in that side chapel. Jose Maria and Maria Jose are buried in that side chapel, as well as a sailor right in front. We actually found parts of the hammered copper communion rail, so we know exactly where that was. And we have the side exit out here to the baptistry. We found the baptistry, absolutely, and there was a there underneath the floor. So I want you to imagine when this place was 1840, what's going to happen is these roof tiles are going to start sliding off of the roof. People from Old Town, what was then the Pueblo, but now Old Town, came up from their houses, the Alvarados, the Estudillos, the Ruizes, came up looking for wood and some tile, fired tile, and basically took the chapel apart. took the commandant's house apart, took those roof tiles, took those lumbers, probably took the doors down to Old Town and incorporated them into their small adobes that they were building down there, starting about 1821, 22, 23. So this is a condition. You see the aerial view looking down on it up in the upper right-hand corner with the side chapel, the nave, sacristy, and on and on. Lots of artifacts, no doubt about it. Thousands of artifacts. And here are two of the more prominent ones. One is on the left, medallion struck in Paris. Mother of Jesus showed up in a chapel next to Notre Dame in 1830 to a nun and told the nun, "You've fallen away. You're ignoring the Catholic Church. You're living the good life as you should with the Catholic Church, and you're not honoring me." So without getting into Catholicism, there was quite a debate going on at the time and prior to this, 1830, about Mary. The Jesuits did not venerate Mary the way the Franciscans did. So long story short, these medals were made, probably thousands of them, and they show up all over. They show up in France, they show up in Germany, they show up in Brazil, they show up in San Diego, 5 or 6 at the Presidio, 4 or 5 at Mission San Diego, and they're made out of very, very good brass, so they last a long, long time. And what it's commemorating is the miracle of Paris. So if you were in Paris in 1830, 31, 32, this was a big deal that Mother Mary had come to this little chapel, not to Notre Dame, not to another larger chapel, but had come to this little chapel and appeared. On the right-hand side is a crucifix. And typically, if you're dealing with Franciscan crucifixes of this time period, you will have Jesus on the front, and then on the back, you'll have Mary. So I have shown you the backside of it here. If this were a Jesuit crucifix of the type you'd find down in Baja California, you would not have Mary on the crucifix. So art history can tell us a lot about time periods because, of course, the Jesuits were kicked out of Baja California around 1769 when the Franciscans moved in, and the crucifixes change over time. Coin from 1777, Carlos III. Coins are very rare. You always hear about Spanish gold and Spanish coins. By and large, the missions were roughly poor, but they certainly, even if they were doing well, like San Luis Rey or Santa Barbara, they did not have coinage. It was very unusual. But we did, in fact, find one of these reals by there in the mission. Phoenix buttons, one of my favorites, because, again, they were made about 1830 for the Emperor of Haiti. He loved Napoleon. He loved the French, Haiti being very, French colony. So King Ferdinand had these buttons made. They were made in England, and it says, "From my ashes I will arise." There's your phoenix bird coming up. You got the regiment number on the bottom. He commissioned tens of thousands of these. They were shipped over to Haiti, and by the time they got there, he was dead. There'd been a coup. His brother-in-law had him killed and took over. These buttons sat in a house for a couple of years, and when some Yankee sea captains and sea traders came by, they picked them up, probably cheaply, and then brought them around the Horn, and we find them throughout the West Coast, Hawaii, Alaska. The largest concentration is up in the Klamath Valley, where I think 60 or 80 of them were found in a Native American burial ground. We find them at the Presidio. We found them at the Mission. They've been found at several places in Old Town. They've been found in the Cuyamaca Mountains. And again, for archaeologists, these are lodestones because they can't exist for 1830, right? So if you find it on a burial, if you find it on anywhere, it's got to be after 1832, 1833. Good indicator. These were probably not used as buttons, by the way. They were probably used more as ornaments sewn onto clothing. One of the neat things, both at the Presidio and the Mission, is I believe that Native Americans, Kumeyaay, were etching into the floor tiles before they were fired. So there's a couple that we have that I wrote an article on that you can search out. And it talks about, I think the Kumeyaay were doing some sacred objects, which I'm not showing you today, into the floor tile and then firing them and then putting those floor tiles at specific places in both Mission San Diego up in Mission Valley and the San Diego Presidio mission. So the one on the left, one could call them doodles or skulls. This is a very common motif found on Native American pictographs. On the right-hand side, I think it's someone sitting at the foot of Presidio Hill, looking south. You can see the hills being shown, I think, here, and then the Presidio itself, and then a flagpole and a flag. It's probably, by the way, the Mexican Army flag. So the beauty of looking at these sketches into floor tiles is they can kind of be an ink blot test. You can maybe see what you want to see. What I think this is a priest with his shroud on and then his cloak and either a band or a strap or perhaps a chain across. So this is clearly done with a finger, not a stylus or an etching. And someone asked me at a lecture I gave a couple ago, well, why didn't they show the face better? It's not typical in Kumeyaay art to show faces. It's very, very unusual, very unusual. It's just part of their cosmological view that you don't do that. They could have, obviously, but they chose not to. Others think this might be a soldier. And I suppose if you believe in Von Daniken, then it's an astronaut from outer space who came and helped build the Presidio. Lots of beads. I don't call these trade beads at the Presidio because they were being used to pay the Native American workers. These are made in Murano, Italy. We find them throughout the Americas, and in many cases, they are trade beads. They were used to trade for food, used to get friendship going with Native Americans. So in Baja California, we find them from Father Serra and Portola's first trip up the coast to San Diego. And in his documents, Portola talks about giving trade beads to try to get friendship going. Here, so many of them, and some are on burials, some are not. I think it's a form of payment. I have to kind of wonder how many of these trade beads didn't stay at the Presidio. Instead, if I were a Native American, I worked making tiles, cooking food, working for the commandant, who knows what, and I'm given a string of trade beads, or maybe a handful. Those are more valuable to my cousins in the back country than they are perhaps to me. So if I'm wanting some deer, if I'm wanting a acorns, if I want something from my cousins somewhere else, trade beads are going to be a great example of what I can use. So in that case, they're traded, but they're traded probably from Kumeyaay to Kumeyaay. We do find these in the Cuyamaca. Some of you have been out to the Bancroft Ranch House in Spring Valley, the village of Mette. We found them out there. Upper left-hand corner is a close-up of what we call a faceted bead. And then lower left, these are the more traditional shell beads that we find at both the Presidio and the Mission. And these are made out of Olivella shells. Here's Natalia Fitch. I won't go into the whole Fitch story since I took a while to get my screen working here. But many of you know about Natalia Fitch and the Fitch family. Natalia was one of the daughters of Henry Delano Fitch and his wife, Joseph, and Henry Fitch himself. Henry Fitch was a sea captain, married into a store in Old Town that you could go down and visit. And he had a friend, who had another store in Old Town. And Henry Delano Fitch bought these brass tacks, these very tacks that you're seeing here, as well as the ones that will end up on his coffin, from his friend Snook. We have the inventory. We know how many he purchased. So NF is for Natalia Fitch. The hearts are very common on a lot of Catholic burials of this time, and then the cross. So it's hard to see the dimensions on this, but at the point that one is in a coffin with a lid and over tens and tens of years, and fertilizer being put on the grass at the Presidio and irrigated nearly constantly, the body decays. much more rapidly than it would have been had it not been under a grassed park. And what happens is the coffin lid actually sinks down. It rots on the edges and it sinks down. So quite literally, um, these tacks and the lid itself went down somewhat uniformly. And her skeleton, was still beneath this. Natalia Fitch, roughly 1845. And it was a redwood coffin, by the way. Where'd they get redwood? They would actually ship the coffins down from Monterey. Lots of Staffordshire ware, those of you that are into ceramics. The most common ceramic at the Presidio Chapel, and I think throughout the Presidio, was T-zone brownware, the local Native American ware. Why? Because you have Kumeyaay women living there. Some are married in, some are serving there as workers, and they're making pottery, especially in the early years when there was not a lot of trade allowed between America, what became America, and France, England, Denmark. So you made pottery. So if one of the women who I'm writing a story on, Sinusin, Kumeyaay woman from Bonita, married in, I'm sure she made pottery for her husband, maybe her husband's bachelor soldier friends, maybe for the commandants. And so we find thousands of sherds of T-zone brownware. And after a while, they start having non-traditional aspects to them, like cups with bottoms on them, which was not typical, like loops, handles on ollas, not typical, not traditional. And my friend Steve Van Warmer and Susan Walters, in their exhaustive study they did on the ceramics, pointed out Kumeyaay women were making cazuelas, which is a casserole dish, completely not only not traditional, but unheard of amongst the Kumeyaay. So someone within the Presidio must have ordered that, more than one, and said, can you make us something shaped like this one over here, the one that broke? Sure, I can do that. So now at the Presidio, we have T-zone brownware cazuelas. You could write this off if you look at it from a colonial viewpoint as acculturation. I don't think the Kumeyaay are acculturating. I simply think they're being opportunist. You want me to make this? Sure. You got some trade beads? Oh, it's your friend? I can do that for him. So a lot of T-zone. After 1821 and the Mexican Revolution and the ban on trade breaks down, we start getting a lot more British and French wares. Probably right behind T ware in sheer quantity is Maiolica. And some of you who might know a little bit about Maiolica, look at the spelling and go, you know, Richard, you should have done a spell check. Well, here's the deal. In most of the Spanish Mexican documents of this time period, and according to Steve Van Warmer and some other things, this is more typically how it would have been spelled. Not with a Y, like I spelled it for 20 years, but this way. But you know, let's not argue about exactly how we want to spell it. If you look into this and you believe it should be spelled one way, then certainly you get to spell it that way. But this is not a spelling error. It's a choice. So this is a very, very common Maiolica blue on white. It was the most common Maiolica found at the Presidio. Over the years, these little frets or the thickness of this line or the bird or the image in the middle would change stylistically, as ceramics do, right? Tail fins on 1957 Chevys were different than 1950. So we can date certain deposits based on the styles. And as you probably know, you can still buy Maiolica. You can buy it in Old Town. You can certainly buy it in Baja California and throughout Mexico. You can go down to Puebla, to Lacapaqui. You can buy crates of Maiolica. So very, very common and inexpensive relative to the European wares. I'll mention Susan Walters and Steve Van Warmer. If you go to academia.edu, you can look at their, I think it's 5-volume paper work, opus, on the ceramics of the Presidio. 1774, 1775. 1774, the mission was moved from Presidio Hill to where its current site approximately is today in Mission Valley. Father Luis Jaime, shown here on the ground, being killed, being martyred. In 1774, Jaime petitioned Father Serra and the Archbishop in Mexico to move the mission out of the Presidio. And the reason was he was getting very few conversions. The Native Americans, especially the women, did not want to come up the hill into the Presidio where the soldiers were. The soldiers were considered dangerous. I think the Kumeyaay were already catching on to some of the diseases that were being spread. There were rapes in Sorrento Valley, in El Cajon, by soldiers. So having a mission where you're trying to convert the Indians and show them the ways of Jesus amongst soldiers was a contradiction. So permission was given, and they moved the mission. They took the rug they had then. They took the saint statues. They took the baptismal font and moved it to Mission Valley. Built a new mission, started a new mission in 1774. Wasn't quite done in 1775, November. The walls, the adobe walls, were maybe 2 or 3 feet high, and the rest was brush and tules. On November 4th, 1775, 18 villages, more or less, of Kumeyaay warriors attacked the mission. About half of the warriors were outside the mission, attacking it, and the other half surrounded the Presidio. If the guard at the Presidio had not been asleep and would have woke up and sounded the alarm, and soldiers poured out the door, although there were less than 20 there, they all would have been killed. But the soldier did not wake up. So instead, the mission was set fire. Father Luis Jaime was killed, and 2 other people, a blacksmith and a soldier, were killed on that fateful November 4th through the 5th. The next morning, the survivors made their way back to the Presidio, the 6 miles, carrying Father Jaime's body. Father Serra called him the of Alta California and said now the crops, in this case meaning converts, will grow because the field has been watered with the blood of Father Jaime. This is probably a reasonably accurate depiction with the macana, the club being held in one hand, spear, and arrows. Father was buried initially at the Presidio, near the altar. And then later, when the mission was rebuilt up in Mission Valley in 1776, he was moved. So you got to with me here. We had two missions on Presidio Hill. Then we have one built in Mission Valley, 1774. It's burned in 1775. When the new one was built in 76, it was not built on the site of Father Jaime's. It was moved over slightly to the west, close to where it is today. So that's the second church in Mission Valley, which is the 4th church. It's called Mission San Diego de Alcala. And it was built about 1780. And then in 1805, the mission that you walk into today, which is the 3rd mission in Mission Valley, and the 5th mission with that name, was completed in 1805. All right. One of the soldiers who was killed, the soldier who was killed, was Alejo Antonio Gonzalez, and he was described as being murdered by 3 arrows, 1 in the upper left-hand chest and 2 in his groin, and he bled out. I think we found him. I'm pretty sure we found him. So I want to stress there's no Native American burials being shown in this presentation or anything sacred that I know of to Native Americans. So this is a Spanish soldier. I believe he was from the Sonora area. And we did good study on him in the ground, if you will. So we know his height, what his weight probably was. His teeth are European, not Native American. And he's got 2 arrows stuck in him. We did not find the 3rd one in the groin of the 2 that were in the groin. So here's Mission San Diego Alcala today. This was built in 1805. The 1780 mission would have been further west, out by the east, out by the, and Father Serra's church was even further east in that grassy area that's fenced off now. Some of you might remember in 1989, I had the misfortune to dig out there in that grassy area when Father Egan wanted to build a diocese out there. And I think we found Father Jaime's church. I'm pretty sure we did. And then we also found parts of the 1780 church. But that's a whole other lecture and story. So don't let them kid you. If you go to Mission San Diego and they try to tell you this first mission and out to California, by name, mission, it's the fifth. So T-zone brownware pot. This was found not at the mission or the Presidio. This was actually found somewhere else. This is on display at the San Diego Archaeological Center in San Pasqual Valley. But you get the idea of it. This would have held about I think 2.5, 3 quarts. It's a pretty good size Oya, and it's got the fire clouding on it. So when I tell you that we found thousands of these, think about this pot being broken initially, broken again, and pieces go everywhere. So you're going to find a lot of different pieces all over the place. This is the book that came out in October, and I've given a couple of presentations on. If you've not purchased one already, and you're going to show up for the tour next week or whenever it is, I believe it's very soon, at the Presidio itself, you could buy one in advance and bring it, and I'll sign it, or I will have them for sale that particular day. This is roughly what a Mexican period soldier would have looked like at the Presidio. So this is, I believe, my last slide. I might have a sunset, but I apologize again for getting a little behind, and I'll be glad to answer any questions here in a minute if Dean wants to set that up. So this is what a Mexican soldier would have looked like typically. Muskets were very rare, certainly no rifles. None of these muskets were rifled, but what would have been common would have been a sword, typically a dagger, and then basically a spear. Right? This was very common. At the Battle of San Pasqual in 1846, it'll be the spears that will bring Kearny's troops to their knees and lead to the death of several of them in 1846. So let me summarize. You dozed off for a second. Presidio was built in 1769, very rudely, brush hut. Got a lot of improvements in the 1770s, mid-1770s, especially, in fact, after the sacking of the mission in 1775. So that's probably when some of the walls were built, things were reinforced. Probably the highest period was 1778 with Zuniga's church into maybe 1810, 1815. After the Mexican Revolution of 1821, no more supplies were being set up, very few supplies at least. Mexico became Mexico, not Spain, not Nueva España. Times were tough, money was hard to come by. And so gradually the San Diego Presidio in particular versus Santa Barbara Presidio, which was attached right there at the mission, very close, fell apart. San Diego started coming apart. The commandants came and went. Soldiers came and went. Some people have estimated there were never more than 120 people at the Presidio. And again, 2/3 of those may have been children. How many Spaniards were there? Because we call it a Spanish fort. Basically, only 2 or 3 Spaniards had ever been at the Presidio. That is, of the people who lived at the Presidio, very few had ever been to Spain, were not born in Spain. Most of them were born in Sonora, Baja California, and down towards Mexico City, perhaps. There was at least one Afro-Caribbean soldier who married a Native American woman, her second marriage, and they had children. So, we're big on diversity. I don't think you could find a place more diverse in some ways than the Presidio. You had Henry Delano Fitch, Yankee sea captain. Later on, you're going to have the Sylvester Patty and some fur trappers imprisoned there, white guys, right? You've got people from Spain, people with roots to Spain, and then later Mexicans. I prefer Californios, started pretty early. So, and then you've got this Afro-Caribbean. You had one person from Brussels who was there. So if you dropped in the Presidio at a given time, you'd hear different languages, different dialects, probably people from Spain who would have come over by 1800, hardly have recognized some of the Spanish being spoken. So with that in mind, and subject to what Dean might want to do, I think we may have a few minutes left here. I'll slide off and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Richard. That was really interesting. I'm sure everybody else thought it was interesting. I neglected to say, if you have any questions, please put them in either the chat or the Q&A feature, and we can answer those. Yeah, we got a compliment, a very interesting and informative presentation. I'm not seeing any questions. Let me see if I have anything. And if you want to unhide your view, you can.
Okay.
What evidence most clearly changed our understanding of life at the Presidio?
I think for a lot of people, especially people who very, very different places, lump them together the way some people easy. We talk about colonialism. The Native Americans at the Presidio, as well as the non-Native Americans, had far better nutrition. It looks like they lived a little bit longer. We don't see in the skeletal material for the Native Americans, there's more than 20 of them buried there. We don't see the malnutrition, the anemia on them. So it looks like as workers, if you will, as trabajeros, better fed, not as abused. And if you think about it, it makes sense because once the mission was moved to Mission Valley, they're not trying to missionize people to Presidio. So I think for a lot of people, that might be surprising. I think the fact that there were so many children, if you say, hey, name the artifacts we might find at a Presidio, a lot of people, many people are not going to say, oh, toy cannons, dolls, marbles. It's going to be muskets, balls, gunshot, swords, things like that. So I think the excavations, and there's still lots to study because many of the collections have not been studied. I think it gives us a much fuller view of early colonial Spanish, then Mexican San Diego and out to California. That's what I was most surprised by, I think. Yeah.
Are there, excuse me, are there parts of the Presidio that remain unexcavated, and what do you hope might still be found?
I would say easily 2/3 of the Presidio. Well, I'll change that. About a half of the Presidio or more have not been excavated. And frankly, there's no to excavate them. There's a ethic now amongst most archaeologists. You should not excavate something unless it's endangered, especially if, and we do, there are literally tens of thousands of artifacts sitting at either San Diego State University or, of all places, in the assessor's office downtown San Diego that have never been studied. Literally tens of them. And from the Bartel excavations, a lot of the other excavations, that material could all be studied in the future. That's where the focus should be. And hopefully in the future, those can be. San Diego State right now is starting to do some work with the Presidio material. And down the road, the hope is Native Americans will be very involved in that cataloging and that analysis because, again, so much of it is American. So Judith, good to see you out there or see your note. It's being held down there because it's climate controlled. And the always Zeldug, which is probably the bulk of what we have in one way, certainly from the chapel, that's at San Diego State. The material that Jack Williams dug is at the assessor's office because it's a city park and the artifacts technically belong to the city. And they used to be in another building that was not climate controlled. So because of Myra Frank and Myra Herman and some other people at the city, it was decided to put them there. They're not available for study at this point because they're not set up to do it. Been very good in that office of sharing all the documents that they've scanned and the field notes and the logbooks. So that's why they're down there.
All right. Let's see. Excuse me. What challenges exist today in preserving and interpreting the site?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is the challenge that is preeminent in everything we do in culture, and that's money or lack of money. So unless some grants are achieved, and it's hard to get grants to study existing collections because it kind of encourages people not to study them as they them. Oh, I'll get a grant, but should be. That's going to be the hardest thing is getting the money. I think the other um, not hurdle, because it's a different time, is involving Native Americans and getting them involved. And that's happening on the analysis of the Bancroft Ranch House in Spring Valley right now. Hamul is basically funding.
You've frozen up, Richard.
I'd like to see the Native Americans and then other archaeologists and historians get involved with very specific topics. It could be the ceramics. It could be what were they eating? A friend of mine, Paul Chase, wrote an article called The First Chicken Burrito in California because we found chicken bones. And so, you could look at it from a faunal thing. But I think the challenge, the willpower, and an interesting thing has happened, and it tends to happen in academia. Graduate students don't want to study necessarily an older collection not generated by one of their professors. And I'm not picking on people here. It's just as professors, having been one for 30 years, you tend to guide your students and your researchers towards your research interest or towards things that you're familiar with. So it's not likely that someone's going to, at least in the near future, focus on studying that collection. And it would take years to do.
And what do we know about the materials and construction techniques used in the Presidio in building other than the church?
They would have been strikingly similar. Zuniga and the other people who were involved in directing the excavations actually had books on architecture, including one going back to Rome. And so they knew about, clearly, obviously making different adobe. They knew about you have to dig that trench and put boulders in it to make it rise above ground level, because if you put an unfired adobe blocks in a trench, they're going to melt. Capillary action, it's just going to suck water up. So we know that occasionally some engineers were sent both to the mission and the Presidio to oversee it, but largely these are going to be men, Zuniga and others, who grew up on the frontier, who saw missions being built, who saw adobes being built, probably took part in them, and they brought that almost folk architectural skill to it. So with the side chapel, we could tell at the mission, church, that it had been the world later. They put out a piece of it. For the soldiers' barracks and the casitas for the married people, based on Bartel's work and Jack Williams, they were pretty small little huts, almost 12 by 10, 12 by 15 little casitas, and they were not nearly as well made as what we think the commandant's house was and the Presidio. They're pretty rude structures in an architectural sense, and I can almost imagine some of the soldiers. The front was 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 made quite well because that's where the gate was. That's where the prison was. The prison floor was not tiles, 3 deep in large boulders, so you couldn't dig your way out. So that's part of the untold story of the Presidio was the difference in the architecture. Good.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess that's it for the question. So thank you so much, Richard. It was really illuminating and fascinating. Thanks to everybody for joining us today and for your thoughtful engagement. If you enjoyed today's lecture, we invite you to continue the experience in person with our special guided walking tour of Presidio Park, led by Richard, next Saturday, February 21st at 11 a.m. It's a 90-minute tour, and it offers a wonderful opportunity to explore the landscape discussed today and connect the archaeology and history to the place itself. Registration is now open with discounted pricing for SOHO members, and you can also purchase a copy of Richard's book in advance when you buy your tickets, and he'll sign it for you after the tour, or as he said, you can buy them at the tour too. We're also excited to remind you that this is just the beginning of our 2026 Penning the Past season, with more lectures ahead that explore SOHO San Diego's neighborhoods. If you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to click the like button. Oh, I forgot to mention, you can get your tickets for the tour at the sohosandiego.org website. If you're looking for it, just click on the Penning the Past box on the front and look up Richard's lecture, and the information will be in that description. It's also in the email I sent with the link to today's Zoom presentation. Thanks again for spending part of your day with us. We look forward to seeing Richard next week at the Presidio. Thank you for supporting SOHO's ongoing work to preserve the historic places that make San Diego unique. We hope to see you again, both online and out in the field. Thank you, Richard. That was great. We appreciate it.
Thanks for sharing.
All right, everybody have a good day. Thank you so much.